Welcome to this course on Phonetics and Phonology, a broad overview, NPTEL MOOC course. And we are in the last unit of this course, and we have been discussing tone and intonation in this unit of this course. So let us continue with our discussion of intonation. In the last lecture, we talked about the acoustic properties of intonation, how the F0 parameters, how they're manipulated in intonation, and how we use the various aspects of phonetics are seen in intonation. So in this lecture, I will concentrate more on the phonology of intonation and also talk a bit about tone. So intonation can be thought of in terms of the continuous movement of pitch as well as in categorical terms. And pitch modulation involves marking of prominence, that is parts which are more important, which we had already seen in the last lecture, and breaking the pitch contour into groups, which is also phrasing, and we'll see that shortly. A broader definition of intonation includes loudness and segmental properties like pitch and length, quality, and all the other auditory percepts. So, an intonation in languages like English and German, prominence appears on a designated syllable. So, these are languages with phonemic stress, and this is not the case for all languages. Some languages use pitch movement without the accompanying loudness, length, and vowel reduction. And English and German are referred to by Beckman 1986 as stress accent languages, in contrast to Japanese, which is non-stress accent language. It is a pitch accent language where pitch movements occur with stress, and whereas also pitch movements occur in stress accent languages also, but it is not on a designated syllable. But in languages with pitch accent languages, we have pitch on the designated syllable, and that's the difference between stress accent and non-stress accent languages. So this is a distinction that is commonly used to discuss how languages with proper stress like English and German will be different from languages like Japanese. But then there are also languages like, unlike English, German, or even Japanese, languages which do not have stress in such a way that you had to test that the significant vowel reduction or their length distinctions, etc. And in those languages, stress is there, but it is not used in a way such that different words vary in where the stress occurs. So in those languages, there's a difference between in the rhythm of those languages and rhythm of English, and we will not go into all those details, but it is good to keep in mind that English and German may not be typical of stress accent languages. So, and then degrees of prominence. Even in a language like English, we have stress accent in some words, and in some more prominence, and in some words secondary prominence. In an intonation language, pitch does not distinguish words. Phrase level pitch patterns, which convey abstract meanings of their own, and English and most other European languages are intonation languages. It is typical for an intonation language to have stress. The central idea here is that there is a text and a tune. The text is simply the words, the vowels, consonants, all the properties associated with segments, and then there's a tune. So the tune is the pitch pattern with which the words are said. So different tunes have different texts, and so vice versa. So text can also have the same text can also have different tunes. And central to the idea of intonation or phonology is also the idea that there are tonal autosegments. Tone is like a phonological segment, except that its content specifies only pitch features. For present purposes, let us adopt a simple feature system for pitch, and then we can have two features, say plus high pitch or plus high pitch or minus high pitch, or plus low pitch or minus low pitch. And then this is a kind of representation that is used in the phonology to understand pitch in terms of binary features like high and low. So what we'll show here is the idea of phonetic interpolation. That is, the pitch movements, the most significant pitch movements are the ones which are the most important parts of an utterance, and all the other parts are a part of the phonetic interpolation. So we had seen in our last lecture that how we have what we call as microprosody, consonantal perturbations, and here you see that as a result of phonetic interpolation, all those parts where you do not have any significant pitch movements, those are linked from the from one part to another part, so that they are not considered as for the understanding of the tune of the text. So the relative heights of the points corresponding to tones match fairly well with tonal category, and the shape of interpolations between tones is not phonologically contrastive. So the shape is not contrastive, neither is the difference in small heights, so those are also not contrastive. It's just significant changes, so high and low, which are considered for an understanding of intonation. So it seems legitimate not to assign phonological representation to random sequences. So phrasing. We had talked about how we have how speech is divided into parts, and those smaller components, they can also be called chunks. These chunks have been termed breath groups, sense groups, tone units, tone groups, phonological phrases, or intonational phrases. And the most obvious indicators of boundaries between intonation units are pauses. So how do we know that there are chunks, that there are groups? Because we know that there are pauses. And the longer the pause, the stronger the perceived boundary. However, it may not always be easy to determine these boundaries. Some other aspects of prosody of intonation is that the strengthening of segments at the beginning of phrases, it's called domain initial strengthening, and it can be seen in various languages that the initial segments are always emphasized, that they're pronounced properly, called domain initial strengthening, or they could be lengthening, etc. And then on the other hand, resistance to assimilation across large boundaries. So in larger boundaries, phonological assimilation processes may be prevented. So segments preserve identity, enhancing the contrast. So, and this happens both at a syntagmatic level and a paradigmatic level. So in a sentence or in domains across sentences, this can happen. And then there is final lengthening. Final lengthening is also a feature of intonation across languages. Final lengthening leads to an increase in the duration of segments, which is different from the increase obtained by stress and accent. And then there is the other property, the property of tone, that we have not talked about so much. Categorical tonal contrasts at word level are characteristic of tone languages. And also there is a feature of grammatical tone, which you don't see in languages like Mandarin Chinese. So grammatical tone refers to tones which indicate some grammatical property like tense or aspect, etc. And also categorical tonal contrasts are also characteristic of so-called pitch accent languages, which we have already talked about, and which may also have lexical or grammatical tone. Both Swedish and Japanese are pitch accent languages, but it's difficult to draw a dividing line between these two categories. So let's play tone from Cantonese. We can see that here the example given here, we have 6 levels, and we'll play the different tones for the segmental combination ma, and then we'll hear that one is high level, one is mid level, one is low level, one is low falling, low high, or low mid. So and then what is tone again? Tone is used in a tone language. Pitch is used in such a way that lexical entries of morphemes bear tone and they indicate different meanings, and it could be just like segmental information. So here we play Cantonese tone.
C, 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 C.
So that was a Cantonese tone, and for C, sorry, it's on ma. And now talking about Japanese pitch accent again, so we see 3 Japanese words here meaning 3 different things: scroll, beef stew, and Japan. And then we can see that in the third mora we have pitch accent. So we play actually this is from Wikipedia. We have 2 nice examples of hashi, and where in one we have accent in the first mora, in the second we have accent in the second mora. I'll just play this clip from Wikipedia.
These examples are meant to demonstrate Japanese pitch accent. Example 1. Hashi, meaning chopsticks with an accent on the first mora. Hashi, meaning bridge with an accent on the second mora. Hashi, meaning edge with no pitch accent. Compare. Hashi, hashi, hashi.
Okay. And syntactic functions. So syntactic structure and intonational phrasing are strongly related, but exact correspondence is not considered necessary. And intonation can be used to disambiguate in certain cases between 2 different syntactic structures. And also in prepositional phrases, it's used for disambiguation. And another important part when you talk about syntactic structure and intonation is information structure. And an important linguistic function of intonation is the marking of information structure in particular. And to express givenness, second to show the division of utterances into focus and background elements. And it is also sort of a continuum rather than a dichotomy, because as entities are simply not given or new, and so to say that something is given or something is new, and also there may be intermediate levels between the 2 extremes. So here is an example of givenness, and suppose just to give you an example of givenness, what did John drink? John drank coffee. So in information structure, this would be your new information, which will give you a focus. And then this is given all information and background, this or presupposition as it is called in information structure, and need not be what we mean to say is that these parts, the other given all background, description, presupposition, etc., could also be focused and not just a new information which is focused, but it's generally assumed that the one which is the new information carries the focus. And then the second aspect of information structure is, as we said, focus and background elements dependent on elements in a discourse which have been introduced as new and the intentions of the speaker. And there is a relation between focus and new information on one hand and background and givenness on the other, but they are not always exclusive, mutually exclusive. The relationship can be orthogonal. And both of these structures represent so-called narrow focus. What is important is that this element is accented irrespective of its degree of givenness. So as we said before, irrespective of givenness, either John or drank or coffee could be focused. And the preference to which element receives the accent thus serves as focus and that could also be language specific. And then LAD 1996 points out many languages that place the focus exponent on the argument rather than on the predicate. Another important thing when we talk about intonation is biological factors. So, Carlos Hussenhoven has shown how research on the different factors affecting intonational form and also how they interact. Hussenhoven claims that the form-function relations are based on biological codes which are grammaticalized, and these are the frequency code, the production code, and the effort code. And each code has affectative or informational interpretations and have linguistic manifestations in other languages. So, what are the frequency code and production code and the effort code? So, in the frequency code is when we have the secondary use of the frequency code. That is, what is the frequency code would say that in languages we have, depending on whether you are asking a question or a statement, etc. And so these are, so as we saw when we are asking a question, the pitch rises, and when it's a statement, it is a falling intonation. So we often find a grammaticalization of the frequency code, and then however there are also we also have different ways of interpreting the frequency code, as because there are languages which do not use the rising tone sometimes. And then we have the effort code. Effort code would say that more effort is put in when you have to emphasize something. And then suppose would you like still more coffee? So would you like still more would you like some more tea? So we are so when we are expressing something like that, we are emphasizing on more to say, to focus there. So and we are putting in a lot of effort to say that, and that would be the grammaticalization of the effort code. So and then there are examples that that we have where in tone languages high tones are lowered and low tones are raised in negative sentences from the verb onwards, and these could be it could be interpreted as some way of expressing the effort code. And then we have the production code. So the that as shown by Hussenhoven, that the production code says that that to produce, to say, to express something which is small and not threatening, etc., we use a high pitch, but to show that something is for instance large creatures, or that you are authoritative, you use sort of a lower pitch, and that code could also be grammaticalized. And so that is the that is the research which shows that the different factors affecting intonational form, and they can also interact in the grammar. Now we come to models of intonation, and pitch can be either captured as pitch configurations such as rise, fall, and so on, or as a sequence of targets. And targets specify only specific points. In the fundamental frequency contour, represented phonologically as tones, and high tones correspond to high targets, low tones to low targets. And these tones can be combined into complex pitch accents like LH representing a rise and HL a fall, or boundary tone combinations LH, etc. So what are the models of intonation? We have the British school, which uses rise and falls as primitives, and then we also have the autosegmental, which uses high and low. So the British school shows that the most important contour is the nuclear tone, and it starts as the nucleus or nucleus syllable, and the utterance's most prominent syllable continues to the end of the phrase, and the nucleus represents only the obligatory part of the tone group. And then a tone group consists of a prehead and a head and a nucleus. So the prehead is the unaccented syllables before the first pitch accent, and the head is of course the first pitch accented syllable, to including the nuclear syllable, and a nucleus, last pitch accented syllable within a tone group. Tail and a tail post unaccented post nuclear syllables. Now, unlike the British school with the tone head, prehead, and nucleus and a tail, we have autosegmental metrical model, which is currently the most widespread phonological framework for representing intonation in terms of autosegmental metrical, starting with the work of Perambert and then in Ladd. And the division of utterances into phrases and this assignment of relative prominence to elements within the phrase represent the metrical aspect, which was first proposed by Lieberman and Prince. And the association of tones with the metrical structure is the autosegmental aspect of this model. And the term, when we say autosegmental, what does it mean? It refers to the fact that tone should be considered autonomous with respect to the text. And we saw that when we looked at he forgot the erasers, and that we can ask as that as a question or as a surprise or as a declarative sentence, and then we see that the tune is autonomous of the text, and the tune can thus be realized on a great many texts of different lengths and structures. And the greatest advantage compared to the British school model is that tonal information can be precisely located on single syllables and at the edge of phrases, and you do not need entire tone groups, or it's not explained over a whole group of syllables. And in the British school, only direct connection between tones and text occurs on the nucleus, but here the connection is quite direct. In most autosegmental metrical models, the nucleus does not have a special status. It is simply defined as the last fully fledged pitch accent in a phrase. So that is, and does not have the status that it has in the British school. And a widely used autosegmental metrical framework for the description of intonation is TOBE, or tone and break, and this is a system which was originally developed as a transcription system for American English, but has since become a general framework for developing intonation systems. And again, to repeat what we have said initially, intonation can be considered as control modulation of voice pitch, and as we initially said, that you can express this as a continuation, or you can express this categorically. You can say that high and low tones, or you can say pitch variations. So all languages seem to use at least some intonation to mark prosodic information. Intonation can signal information structure, which we saw as focus and givenness, etc., and all versus new information or non-linguistic information like attitude or emotion. So this much we have studied so far. And also we have studied how we have seen how you can say rise and falls, but doesn't tell us much about linguistic structure. And intonational contours can also be described as a string of distinct tonal elements. In other words, a contour is grammatically governed and series of pitch targets, and this is mostly in autosegmental metrical models, and each intonation is determined by three parameters: pitch accent type, pitch accent location, nuclear boundary, and phrasing. So the start tone that we talked about initially, this is also the pitch accent. This is how it's shown with a star, and a tone sequence that aligns with a stress syllable within a phrase. So if it aligns with the stress syllable, then that is L star or H star. The syllable associated with the pitch accent is called an accented syllable. English has two pitch accents, H star, L star, and four bitonal accents, and this is from Perambert: L plus H star, L star plus H star plus L, and H plus L star. And a nucleus pitch accent is a last pitch accent in the intermediate phrase and is the most prominent one. The other important properties are of phrasal tones, tones associated with the edge of a phrase, not to a syllable, and then phrase accents. So also there are phrasal tones, phrasal accents. These are boundaries. These are shown with that percent symbol, H or L percents, showing boundary tones belong to an intonational phrase. And phonetics provides a mapping from these phonological elements to continuous acoustic parameters. So, and we studied, we looked at it in our lecture yesterday. And there are 4 dimensions of intonation based on Lieberman and Pierre-Humbert. And what are those? As we have been repeating so far, tune is very important, prominence, stress is very important, pitch range could be global in the sense that the rise could show a question, and a fall could mean a declarative sentence, or at least a phrase size, a choice of pitch scaling parameters, and declination, downward trend in pitch across a phrase. So these are sort of the dimensions of intonation that you have to consider if you're doing an intonational study. So pitch accent in intonation. So you can have the nuclear accent is either as we said before, the relative the differences do not matter so much, and range between high and low is pretty big, but between 2 highs it may not be very significant. The relative differences do not matter so much. And continuing with phonetic realization from the last lecture, native speaker hears the accented vowel as higher than the rest, even though the maximum pitch may be in the next syllable. So those are some things that one needs to keep in mind while doing an intonation analysis. And if the word doesn't have an accent, the pitch rises continuously from a low at the start of the word to a high at its end. And some things that we can do while studying intonation, that is, we use a software called Prof. We locate, we do pitch tracking using Prof. And we find out how the pitch is changing using the various tools provided in Prof. And so we use the computer pitch tracking, and the pitch tracking algorithms, they do some autocorrelation. So, and then there are other things to consider. There are pitch tracking errors, there are pitch halving, there could be pitch doubling, and all these are problems. And then when you're using Prof, many people use Prof to understand or look at intonation. And these are some things to keep in mind. And then when we're discussing intonation, a couple of things that come into play is that when you're doing a TOBI, that is tone and break indices, we have to remember that it's a system of prosodic labeling that capture prosodic events in an utterance. So when we are doing a TOBI labeling, we have to keep in mind that prosodic events fall into 2 categories, and one is pitch related events that mark some syllables as more salient than others, and pitch related events or patterns that mark phrasing. So as we have been repeating, the pitch related events where we mark prominence and phrasing. So these are 2 important things while if we consider using TOBI labeling for intonation. So these are from TOBI guidelines available for free. TOBI has a tone tier, an orthographic tier, and a break index tier, and a miscellaneous tier. And then there is a H-star peak accent. As we have already talked about this, it's the accented syllable, that is the stress syllable, which gets the pitch accent, and it will be called the peak accent with H-star. And then as we had seen initially when we're looking at Hayes 2009, they had included in pitch in the middle range. Here in the TOBE labeling, we do not use pitch in the middle range, and it is it uses relatively high pitches, excludes the low F0 targets. F0, so a fundamental frequency which is very low can never be H star. And then L star is low accent. And then there are phrasal tones which are L or H phrase accent. This is how they are represented with a dash. And then we have boundaries which are shown the percentage L star or H star. And we have a high initial boundary can be shown with a percentage H, and it marks a phrase that begins relatively high in the speaker's pitch range. And the default initial boundary is in the middle range or lower and will be left, so almost always left unmarked in transcription. And for a full intonation phrase with the L phrase accent ending its final intermediate phrase and L boundary, tone linked to a low point, and this is the standard declarative contour of American English. Then we have LH%. Again, this is the last intermediate phrase followed by H. So this is a continuation rise, and we'll play a sample for you. And then we have HH% for intonation phrase with final intermediate phrase ending in H phrase, continue accent, and subsequent H boundary tone. And it is a canonical yes-no question contour. And note that the H phrase accent causes upstep on the following boundary tone. And then we have HL% for intonation phrase in which the H phrase of the final intermediate phrase upsteps the L% to a value in the middle of speaker's range, producing a final level plateau. So HL% is actually a plateau, and both H% and HL% is a result of upsteps. And scooped accent is the one where you have a low tone target on the accented syllable but followed by a sharp rise. And then we have the rising. So note that there is a difference between L star plus H and L plus H star. We have a rising peak accent, a high peak target on the accented syllable, which is immediately preceded by a relatively sharp rise from a valley in the lowest part of the speaker's range. And then finally we have H plus the exclamation mark. So this is a step down into the accented syllable from a high pitch, which itself cannot be. So this exclamation mark showing that there is a down step of the following H%. So of the following H starred H. So H pitch accent in the same phrase and should be only used in the preceding material is clearly high pitch and accented. So clearly high pitch and unaccented, and then causes a down step in the following accented high. So, and also these are the things that is important for TOBE labeling. Break indices and values for the break index are 0 for clitic groups, etc. And then 1 for phrase medial boundaries, word boundaries, and then 2 for a strong disjuncture, and 3 for immediate intonation phrase boundary, and 4 for full intonation phrase boundary. For example, a typical fluent utterance of a following sentence, do you want an example, might have a 0 between did you, so did you, something like that, and then and wanton, again between the two there may be very little break, so you can have a 0, and then the remaining break index would probably values would probably be 1 between you and want, and an example indicating the presence of a mere word boundary, and 4 at the end of the utterance indicating. So here's an utterance that we'll play now before we end this lecture, which will show that the prominent parts will be very clear, and then the two intonational phrases will also be very clear, the gap between the two parts. So playing it now.
Armani knew the millionaire.
So the sentence is Armani knew the millionaire. So this is you can see the gap. So showing that this is two intonational phrases. As we talked before, the more gap you have, showing that there's strong breaks between two parts. And then as we can see, the L plus H percent here, sorry, L plus H star here, star is located to the, is aligned to the prominent syllable here again in millionaire, again, so this H star on the prominent syllable. And again, all of these, Armani, New, the millionaire, they're all pitch accented, and there are two IPs here. So the acoustic correlates mark prominence, that is high pitch, and groupings are typically the F0 pattern, perceived pitch pattern, and the relative duration. The contributions of other cues such as amplitude, voice quality, pausing, strength of articulation, etc., they are all there. And then in the tone shows phrasing and prominence. The break index here captures primarily phrasing and other grouping information. And so and then the example that you saw is straightforward and context independent, and and then they miss a considerable amount of information. We don't know how those sentences were produced, but again we'll play another sentence here before we wrap up, which shows a basic prosodic pattern in a short utterance.
He was nominated.
So again, this was, he was nominated, so showing the most important stressed part here is showing nominated, and then a final L person showing the boundary, and then these are the most important parts in the sentence. Also, notice that we have one for both as the boundary between these two words. Similarly, for here, again we have New, the millionaire, there is one between New, the, and between Armani and next part we have 4 because those are two IPs. So this has 3 words and is produced a single intonational phrase with one pitch accent. And as mentioned above, the tone tier marks 2 types of events, and these are associated with accented syllables and with phrasing. And then we have falling, and the other intonational event that is labeled in a Toby transcription is the falling F0 at the end of the utterance, and the low pitch region is marked with LL%, whereas the L indicates that there is a low phrase accent that is followed by low boundary tone on the final syllable. And again, like all intonation contours, as we know about tune and text, so they can be produced as on many, the tune can be produced on many strings. And then another example is Mariana Wanet, single intonational phrase with one pitch accent, and the pitch accent is H%, and the phrase accent boundary tone is LL%. So this is the sentence.
Mariana Wanet.
So the sentence is Mariana Wanet, and then so where we have 1 between the break in, this is between 1 and it is only 1, and this is the strongest break of 4. So the break index marks the level of disjuncture between the words, and intonation is one of the acoustic cues to a disjuncture, and between LL% boundary tone signals the maximal level of disjuncture. So this is 4 as we saw it in all the sentences there. If there are 2 IPs in a sentence, even if it sounds like one sentence, Armani, break, and then the rest of the sentence. And other boundaries are marked with smaller break indices. For example, typical word boundary in a fluent sentence of words within a phrase are marked as 1. And then there are levels of intermediate phrasing between intonational phrases that are marked with break indices 2 or 3. 0 is where the is reserved for cases when 2 words are produced, so the boundary between them is intermediate. And we have here with a 0.
He said you would.
So he said she would. So here between said and you, there is very little boundary, because typically the following pronoun is almost like uttered like one word. And to summarize the inventory that we have seen so far, tones H star, pitch accent, and LL% low phrase accent, and low boundary tone, and then break indices 0 for word boundary apparently, so which is almost erased, one typical between word juncture between a phrase and end of an intonational phrase is 4. So with this we saw how we can do Toby labeling. Here all the pictures that you saw are from Pratt, even though we just mentioned Pratt, which is a software, free downloadable software where you can do a lot of analysis of pitch, acoustic analysis, etc. We did not introduce, we did not discuss Pratt a lot in this course, and maybe in another one, but it's very useful for even for the studying of intonation and looking at pitch contours, seeing the breaks between words, etc. And these tiers can also be marked in those by using softwares like Pratt, which allows you to create different tiers for words in a sentence. And also we saw that we can very easily see prominence, the acoustic prominence lent by by properties of F0 and duration, etc., which are very clearly seen in the sentences that we played for you here. And you can see Armani and then Millione, so where you have high pitch showing the prominent syllable. And that brings us to the end of this lecture on intonation, and also the end of this course, and we will interact with you if you have questions, etc., when you are doing this course. Thank you for your attention.